In the last part, I went over how local transit agencies in the GTA often accept each other's transfers for free. For context, I recommend watching the previous part first. In this part, I will focus on the TTC's fare system as it works slightly differently from the rest. I previously mentioned that there is an exception to only needing to tap in on local transit. That exception is when you take a cross-boundary trip on a TTC route. This is also the only agency in which the location where you board a bus does indeed affect the fare that you pay. Let me explain. One route in Mississauga and 5 routes in York Region are actually operated by the TTC with TTC buses and TTC drivers, but are considered My Way and York Region Transit buses respectively for the purposes of fare collection, while these buses are outside of the Toronto fare zone, which is kind of, but not exactly the same as the City of Toronto limits. My Way and York Region Transit pay the TTC to operate these routes for them, rather than operating them themselves. Some of these routes are remnants from when these regions had no or limited public bus networks of their own and thus relied on the TTC for bus service. Before 1973, TTC actually had a more intricate zone system even within Metropolitan Toronto, which is the predecessor to the modern-day amalgamated City of Toronto, with Zones 1 and 2, and anything outside of the Metropolitan Toronto area being Zone 3 and above. Even in the most recent paper transfers, Zones 1 and 3 are still mentioned. Zone 3 is considered equivalent to a My Way or York Region Transit fare, and Zone 1 today covers all of the City of Toronto. The easiest way to think about TTC contracted routes is to pretend that you are changing bus to the respective transit provider in the area when you cross the boundary. In fact, if you look at the onboard fare reader screens as you cross the boundary, the logo will actually change to My Way or York Region Transit rather than the familiar TTC logo. The reverse is true going into Toronto. Since you are now technically on another bus with a separate fare, you pay a second fare by tapping on your way out. And no, it does not matter how many stops from the boundary you are. So yes, getting off even one stop beyond the boundary will cost you about twice as much. I also want to emphasize that this policy is on paper. What happens in real life with regards to the double fare collection is at the mercy of the bus driver on each of these buses. This double fare zone system is in contrast to non-TTC buses, which maintain the same operator for the purposes of fare collection, even when crossing boundaries, meaning that if you're traveling from, say, Finch Station into York Region with YRT, that exact same trip can cost double if you get on a TTC bus up to the border and then switch to YRT, rather than if you only took the YRT bus. Unfortunately, you often have no choice but to either walk or to take the TTC, and consequently pay 2 fares if your origin or destination is close to the border but no YRT route is close by. Not everyone can walk, so the separate double fares are especially unfair for those with reduced mobility. This is also in contrast to taking the Line 1 subway into or out of Vaughan, where you always pay a TTC fare, even if your trip is entirely outside of the City of Toronto. In the past, York Region Transit buses frequently crossed the boundary and served York University, so effectively, no one from York Region had to pay a second TTC fare. But after the Line 1 Toronto-York Spadina subway extension to Vaughan opened in 2017, the buses were deemed redundant and in September 2018 were either removed or cut back to the YRT Pioneer Village bus terminal, which is further away from York University, barely on the other side of the Steeles Avenue boundary. Now, you either had to walk from Pioneer Village Station or take the subway one stop into York University. Taking the subway itself isn't the problem. After all, subways tend to operate faster and more reliably than buses. The problem is that now you had to pay a second TTC fare even if you were traveling from York Region. This is, to say the least, frustrating to those living in York Region and going to or from York University on a daily basis, who now had to pay a full TTC fare just to travel one stop, or 1 kilometer into York University that they didn't have to pay for in the past. This is especially unfortunate for those who can't walk, where they really don't have a choice. Now, going back to the subject of TTC contracted routes. Many people in Mississauga and York Region are used to the TTC not honoring MyWay or York Region Transit transfers within Toronto. So, they may instinctively avoid taking the TTC contracted buses entirely within Mississauga or York Region, even though in that case they would actually accept MyWay or YRT transfers just like any regular MyWay or YRT bus route, and the TTC routes can actually be more frequent than the MyWay or YRT services in that area. One example of where you have a choice to take the TTC contracted routes with only a MyWay fare is if you're traveling from Airport Road west of Pearson Airport to Milton. You can either take the MyWay Route 7 or TTC Route 52 bus with the exact same MyWay fare. Both of these are in fact recommended by Google Maps as they make the exact same stops along the exact same route. But strangely, MyWay displays this route on their system map just like any other TTC route, despite MyWay fares being accepted on this route west of Pearson Airport, whereas YRT at least gives the TTC contracted routes the same red color and actually lists these routes as part of their system. Then there's the issue at Pearson Airport. For context, the TTC operates several routes into Pearson Airport, stopping at both Terminals 1 and 3, along with MyWay, Brampton Transit, GO Transit, and UP Express, which all stop only at Terminal 1. In other words, the TTC is the only operator that services Terminal 3 directly. For the Route 52 TTC bus, only the 52A variation actually serves the airport terminals, while the 52B and D variations remain on Airport Road and continue on to Milton, which is the area of Mississauga northwest of the airport. When I mentioned where the fare zone boundary applies, I said that it is kind of the same as the City of Toronto limits, which in the case of this area is Highway 427, where Dixon Road in Toronto becomes Airport Road in Mississauga. Pearson Airport, despite being in the city of Mississauga, is considered by the TTC to be in the Toronto fare zone so that those traveling between Pearson and Toronto don't have to pay two fares. Fair enough. No pun intended. But this means that anyone traveling between Pearson and Milton taking the TTC from the airport area has to pay two separate fares. This is in contrast to the MyWay or Brampton Transit local buses serving the airport, which charge their own fares respectively, regardless of what city they're currently in. The One Fare program will make this double fare go away for passengers, but not for the provincial government, who now has to deal with the consequences of this oversight by the local transit agencies. Aside from the TTC 52B and D buses, which don't even stop at either of the terminals in the first place, the only other service towards Milton is MyWay Route 7, which, to make matters worse, currently operates less frequently and only stops at Terminal 1. And don't get me started on how the MyWay 107 Express bus doesn't even serve either one of the terminals. If you're coming from Terminal 3 and wish to go to Milton, you either have to take the Airport Link train to Terminal 1, not to be confused with the UP Express train, which also only serves Terminal 1, or take the 52A bus back one stop towards Toronto to the Airport Road and Jetliner Road intersection, and then transfer to either the MyWay Route 7 bus or the TTC contracted 52B or D buses. All of this is especially confusing for tourists and visitors, or even those who work in the area and are new to transit. Unfortunately, if one decides to take the 52A bus out of Terminal 3 rather than the Airport Link, this one-stop ride, technically being entirely within the Toronto fare zone, will cost an additional TTC fare. In order to avoid paying the TTC fare altogether, they in fact should have taken the Airport Link to Terminal 1, then the MyWay bus out of the airport to avoid paying the separate TTC fare altogether. Also, if you're taking the bus from the stops in Toronto just before the boundary, due to the boundary rules only applying to TTC contracted routes, taking the Route 52 TTC bus into Milton currently requires two fares, in contrast to taking the 7 MyWay bus into Milton, which currently only requires a MyWay fare. Assigning Pearson Airport and the nearby stops to be part of the Mississauga fare zone is also not fair to those going to or from Toronto, so the only true option is to designate Pearson Airport and the nearby transfer stops as a neutral area where both fares are accepted and both transfers are accepted at no extra charge, though I doubt PRESTO systems could easily be programmed to handle that kind of situation. Thankfully, these double fare scenarios will soon be a thing of the past, but some questions arise. The one fare program, though with good intentions, will introduce some other interesting consequences. Will cross-boundary trips on TTC contracted bus routes still require tapping on the way out? Will it still be considered fare evasion if you don't tap on your way out, even though the second fare is free? Even though the second fare will be free for you, it is actually the provincial government subsidizing the second fare, meaning that it is in both transit agencies' interests if you continue tapping on the way out for cross-boundary trips on these TTC contracted buses so that they get paid the subsidized fare. For buses to or from York Region, the fare boundary is generally at the Steeles Avenue city limit as expected. You may have noticed that there are two stops close to each other in each direction. This is a consequence of the current double fare system. Since Steeles Avenue is the border for, in this particular location, the TTC contracted Route 160, any rational person aware of the double fares traveling to or from Toronto will use the stops south of Steeles Avenue to avoid paying an extra YRT fare, and anyone traveling to or from York Region will use the stops north of Steeles Avenue to avoid paying an extra TTC fare. But when the one fare program kicks in, people will no longer be burdened to pay two fares and will be inclined to wait at whichever stop is more convenient for them, either because it's nearby or because the TTC fare is always lower than the YRT fare. For an adult going northbound who would otherwise have waited at the stop north of Steeles Avenue, now they'll be encouraged to wait at the stop south of Steeles Avenue, costing the provincial government the second, higher $3.88 YRT adult fare for just one stop. It would also be convenient for someone from York Region going northbound to backtrack and walk south a stop or two into Toronto, then take a TTC bus back into York Region so that they can pay the lower TTC fare for their entire journey. I don't think rare situations like these justify scrapping the entire one fare program, but it does show the need to overhaul fares by making the fare truly one fare, which would mean making all local fares uniform and forcing the TTC to accept transfers issued by other agencies, and to make up for the lost revenue in accepting others' transfers, still providing guaranteed provincial subsidies to all transit agencies involved but split up based on the length of each leg when such information is available. In the next part, I will talk about Go Transit's fare system and its local fare integration in more detail. If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Thanks for watching.